Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button below. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au. Welcome to the 51st Australian Water School webinar brought to you by IceForm. It's great to have you all on board. This webinar series aims to uplift the great ideas and projects in the global water sector. Today, we present one of the fundamental issues in any sector, gender equality in water management, and it's by Melita Grant at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney. I'm Trevor Pillar, the National Partnerships Manager here at IceForm and today's webinar chair. But I wanted to say this quote early on. It's from an AWA Arup Australian Water Outlook report. It says Australia is facing unprecedented challenges when it comes to how we plan and manage our water resources. The nation's future prosperity is inextricably linked to how well our water resources will meet the needs of a growing population, diversified industries, and the protection of the environment. Climate change and rainfall variability are placing increasing pressures on every aspect of the water industry as it grapples with ageing infrastructure and increasing urbanisation. You know, that's so applicable across the board. I read it and thought that works globally. Anyway, that's probably enough for a starter. It gets our thought minds working. What it's all about is you people. Thank you so much for joining us across the globe, attending this really crucial topic about gender equality in water management. There's some training coming up. You can see there from now till December, free webinars, online courses, face-to-face courses. I won't go into each one, but we highly encourage you to join us by going onto our website and registering for those. All of that over with. We're so delighted you can join us, Melita. I'll give you some idea of her background. It's fairly fulsome. I won't read the whole thing, but yes, great to see you. Great to see you. Coming through well. Fantastic. Melita is an experienced practitioner, advisor and researcher in integrated water resources management and water and sanitation and hygiene in Australia and internationally. Her academic background is in political science and environmental management. So watch your politics, she'll be right under that. Melita led a number of projects focused on gender equality within WASH and IWRM for donors, community service organisations and global partnerships. In 2017, she authored the Global Water Partnerships Influential Action Piece on Gender Equality and Water Resources Management, which was adopted, this is the big one, by the UN High-Level Panel on Water. Melita has extensive experience in designing, implementing and evaluating stakeholder engagement programs. With all that, our warmest welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And you're in Sydney, I take it?
That's right. And I just stepped outside to get some fresh air and then was greeted by a storm. So it's nice and rainy here today.
And for Australia, there's probably a lot of cheering going on in some places, in most parts of Australia. That's great news. All right, let's get underway. We're in your hands, Melita. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be great.
Okay, so am I. Strap yourself in, let's go. And thank you very much, Trevor, and for having me and inviting me to talk to this topic, which I know that there will be people in the audience that are also very familiar with this topic and are experts in their own right. So this is really just a conversation starter and to let you know about one piece of research that has turned into a piece of guidance or policy, and then it's been adopted by the UN High-Level Panel on Water in their latest action plan. So it's kind of a story of how research can turn into policy influence. But then, of course, what happens once it's in a document, we want to see that turned into action. So it'd be really great to have a discussion after this presentation about how can we translate these ideas, these principles into real action in our own workplaces, in the sector at large, and also in the broader arenas that we work in, government, NGOs, industry, community, etc. So it's called What Does Inclusive Water Resources Management Involve? Having said that, there is a focus on gender and gender equality principles, noting that that is not inclusion in all its multiple forms. So it doesn't deal with issues of disability or even intersectionality in a really deep way. So that's to say, that is important and needs to be done really, really well. But this presentation focuses much more on the gender aspects of inclusion. Okay, so I'll just give you, Trevor gave a little bio for my background, but I'll just give it to you in pictures. So if this was my life in water in pictures, it would look something like this. So first of all, I studied in political science, looking at large-scale hydroelectricity and looking at civil society movements and political economy issues around big hydro in Laos, PDR and India. And then I was lucky to work for river conservation organisation in northern British Columbia. That's a river, the Taku, that ends up in Alaska. And then I came back to Australia and started working on more domestic issues, looking at drought, how to keep our parks and gardens green during droughts, and worked in Brisbane during a very severe drought where literally our dams were almost at zero. So that was focused a lot on community engagement and strategies around everybody playing their part in managing the drought. Worked for state government in recycling, water, grey water use, and also country towns water sanitation supply issues, and then moved to Oxfam working on a food justice campaign, looking at small-scale farmers and very much at the role of women in small-scale farming and the importance of women to food supplies globally, but also to small-scale farming and the inequalities that are in that space. And now I'm at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, which is at the University of Technology, Sydney. And I do a lot of partnership work with our NGO and government partners in a range of countries in the region. This is an example of a workshop I ran recently in Indonesia with our partners from Plan. And I also do work in Cambodia, looking at the role of women in small-scale private water supply organisations, and in Vietnam. And in essence, I do a lot of post-it noting these days. So a lot of the sessions I run involve a lot of post-it notes, and I feel like this picture really sums up what I do these days. Anyway, moving along. You may have, hopefully you can remember, but if not, in 1992, there was a very large and significant conference called, that culminated in the Dublin Principles. And principle number one was around a holistic approach being needed for water resources management. Principle number two was around participatory approaches being necessary. Principle number three was recognising that women play a central part in the provision, management and safeguarding of water, and that this pivotal role of women as providers and users of water and guardians of the living environment has seldom been reflected in the institutional arrangements for the development and management of water resources. And it says that acceptance and implementation of this principle requires positive policies to address women's specific needs and to equip and empower women to participate at all levels of water resources programs, including decision-making and implementation in ways defined by them. So it's very important, last few words, that this is not a top-down approach telling women what to do and how to do it, and involving them in predetermined ways and modes, but really drawing on the knowledge, the expertise, the wisdom of a group of people that have been often missed out in a lot of water resource management decision-making and forums. And then principle number four is that water has an economic value. So this is just to say that an international meet decided that these four principles were of primary importance for global water management, and that principle number three has specific reference to gender and gender equality, and that's been set since 1992. So this is not a new issue, as we know. There are numerous benefits for taking a more inclusive approach to water resources management. Just a couple of examples are around the full participation of women leads to more sustainable projects. And this has been shown in one piece of research that's cited there that was done in 15 countries. So sustainability is enhanced with a more inclusive approach, ensuring that all views are captured. And then another example is one study by the FAO and World Bank has also cited it, that closing the gender gap through equal access to assets such as land and water, inputs such as seed and fertiliser and training, would increase the yields on women-run farms by 20 to 30%, which would reduce the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. So even just levelling up the ability of women to access the same inputs in their farming as men would have a huge impact on global hunger levels. As we know, this is the I guess the image that comes to mind when most people think about water and women, or inequalities of water management and women. Not to labour this point because we're all familiar with it, but one stat which I think really brings home the point is that UNICEF reported a couple of years ago that 200 million hours are spent every day by women and girls collecting water. 200 million hours, and that's 8.3 million days, or over 22,800 years. So obviously there's huge time spent, and the economic value of that time, the health impacts of that activity, etc., are obvious. So where are we 25 years after the Dublin Principles? Well, women are actually account for around 43% of the agricultural labour force globally, yet their ownership of and access to land and water resources is not equal to that of men. And one study has shown that the laws or customs in 102 countries still deny women the same land rights as men. Often the decisions made in water resource management, whether it be river basin planning or aquifer recharge or irrigation systems, those sorts of decisions, how and where to make a dam, these are often made without marginalised people being involved in those decision-making forums, and often without the involvement of women proportionally. And increasing understanding is definitely growing in this space around gender inclusion issues, but it's been probably it's been stronger in the WASH sector, water, sanitation and hygiene, and less of a focus in water resources management until more recently. And there's lots of reasons behind that. Obviously, women are seen as more connected to the domestic end of the water management cycle. And so in terms of carrying water and sanitation, hygiene, etc. So there is a bit of a gendered element as to why it's become more of a focus at that end of the spectrum. And obviously the engineering technical side that we know to be quite prominent in water resource management. But it's definitely changing, and I'm involved in a lot of WRM forums and organisations, and they're all asking how can we start to contribute positively in this space. And there's definitely international acceptance of the economic and social benefits now of reducing inequalities. We've got the IMF saying reducing inequality is good for GDP. We've got various countries, the SDGs themselves, of course, talk specifically to inequality. So understanding inequality in general is definitely much more prominent and a real focus of a lot of organisations. We also now have thousands of local level initiatives, and this Water for Women partnership has been set up to support a range of civil society organisations all around the world who are putting in place these really beautiful, real, on-the-ground initiatives that involve women, people with disabilities, sexual gender minorities, and really showcasing the wonderful work that's happening at the local level. There's lots of strategies and vision statements out there, and we've got big, large-scale organisations, the high-level panel on water, what I've just mentioned then, adopting this piece of research I'm going to tell you about in a minute is an example of an action plan that sits on a website that is definitely a vision statement, a strategy, but it doesn't actually have any tied funding or budget to it. It's up to the organisations that are supporting it, the high-level panel on water countries, to come up with ways to support that agenda. So there is a real gap between strategies and vision and budget and implementation, which I'll talk to more in this presentation. But at least we've got the words gender, we've got the words inclusion, equality starting to be almost, well, pretty much mainstreamed. So the next step obviously is action. as I mentioned, there's just not a huge amount of evidence of real implementation or adequate resourcing of strategies. And so we're always looking for examples, and feel free to get in touch with me and let me know if you've got an example of how a statement, a vision, a strategy has been well resourced and implemented in your organisations or your domain. I'd be really happy to know more about that. So this is the piece of research that the Global Water Partnership commissioned us to do, and this is in 2017, and it focuses mostly on that part of SDG 6, which is on water resources management, 6.3 to 6.6. And the reason for that is because, as I said, there's a lot more that has been written about and researched in the WASH space. So Global Water Partnership also is more of a WRM-focused organisation than WASH. And the methodology involved 39 experts from all around the world. Almost all parts of the world were captured and represented in some way or form in this research. And they were from 25 leading organisations. So the people were experts in gender and water resource management, usually both. Some were just gender, some were more water resource management, but usually both. And we had academics, and we had people from World Bank, ADB, Coca-Cola. We had people from NGOs, International Rivers, Oxfam, Isimod from Nepal. We had a really lovely range of people that were genuine experts in this connection between gender and water resource management. And I do want to thank them very much for their involvement in this research. And you see that photo up in the top left, that's the high-level meeting we had after the actual interviews were conducted. We then all came together to workshop the high-level messages and the findings, and then that culminated in this action piece. And so there's essentially 4 key principles came out of all of those interviews and discussions. And these probably will be familiar to you, but within the document itself, there's quite a lot of nuancing about what decision-making and participation looks like, or what it means to have various people assigned roles like gender focal points, and how does that actually play out in organisations, that sort of thing. So I do encourage you to read it's a short summary document, but it gives a bit more nuance and practical actions than what I'm going to present now. The first one is around the importance of institutional leadership and commitment. The second one is around the importance of gender inclusion analysis that actually drives change, not just an analysis that then sits on the shelf. The third one is about meaningful and inclusive participation and decision-making and partnerships. And the fourth one is around equal access to and control of resources. So I'm going to go into these 4 in more detail now. First of all, around leadership. The finding was that those organisations that have leaders that are really championing and driving the concept of gender equality, but also then commits through the strategies and vision statements, and then that flows down through the organisation into, at the work plan level, etc. That this is where you see the most change happening. That organisations with strong leaders that are committed to gender and inclusive principles are going to get much further, obviously, than those that don't. So what we're saying is a way to get this to happen is by making gender equality and inclusion a core business goal, and finding those incentives, those business case type reasons to drive gender equality and inclusion within each organisation. And then obviously there will be a need to get the leadership on board and championing, and that can be done in a variety of ways. I'll mention a bit more about that later. Some of the questions that we put in the guide that really help an organisation work out whether or not it is driving gender equality through its institutional leadership and through its commitment to the principles are listed in the guide, and they include things like: does our organisation have a clear strategy to which leadership is committed? And that's a clear inclusion and gender and inclusion strategy. how can commitment and leadership be enhanced at all levels? So does that mean getting your leaders to have some training or meet with some key strategic people to be, attend a forum or have a moment where they really feel the issues through a kind of a site visit or some sort of exposure to the real issues? So some sort of a shift in themselves. So it is ideal to have that leadership on board and driving the change within the organisation. It can be done in a variety of ways. Then also questions like what resources have been made available to implement the strategies, or is it just a document, piece of paper sitting on a shelf? Does the organisation have the skills and capacity to understand and implement gender and inclusion strategies? This can be quite an overwhelming area for some people. They feel like, oh, I don't want to do the wrong thing, I might say the wrong thing. So if people are trained in the language and also the concepts and being brave by being a supporter and a champion, it can be obviously really helpful. And one thing that came through from quite a lot of organisations is this concept of a gender focal point. It's quite a common strategy used by a lot of organisations. They assign one person to be sort of that conduit, that champion within the organisation for gender equality. Invariably, that person is a young woman and she might be quite junior. And so she's really got a big task ahead of her to change an organisation for it to take gender equality issues seriously. So a recommendation in the paper is, yes, it's okay to have that gender focal point as a young woman if she is the best person to do that and she wants to do it. But make sure she's supported and well-resourced and taken seriously, not just put in meetings and then you can tick that box, without her feeling the support and genuine, ear of the organisation. And then then we have a question here: how does your organisation develop and include gender and inclusion expertise? Are there partnerships that you've got with women's organisations, with disabled people's organisations? Is it part of your strategy and ways of working? Or do you bring expertise in, or you develop that capacity in-house? So it's looking at the how and how do you draw in that expertise which in your organisation you may not already have. And partnerships is obviously a really great way to do that. And then this comes back to sort of that business case around incentives. And the paper talks specifically to the types of incentives that all the stakeholders in the research identified, everything from having a social contract or social license to operate through to it being good for corporate social responsibility, So finding those ways that will speak the language of your organisation, but also genuinely make it interesting to a new audience and relevant. And then finally, what accountability mechanisms are in place to ensure that policy and practice are linked? So we talk about mainstreaming gender in organisations, which means that every part of the organisation is considering those inequalities and addressing them as much as possible. But unless it's linked to an accountability mechanism like monitoring, evaluation and learning, or some sort of KPIs or in-work plans, that sort of thing, then it obviously is an easy one to just go by the wayside and be missed. So it really needs to be anchored in some accountability mechanisms to make it real. So that's just an example of the kinds of questions and the content that is in the guide, and that's just for the first principle. In the interest of time, I'll probably go a little bit more quickly through the other 3 principles, but just know that there are these checklists for you within the guide against each of the 4 principles. So the second one is about gender analysis. So that's understanding what is the gender, what are the gender norms of the situation you're working in, and how can we be sure that we don't do any harm? So we don't want to be going into any context and actually aggravating or making more trouble. So how do we do no harm? And also how might we be able to support a gender transformational approach, which is supporting those actors within a society that we're working in that are driving change and in the most contextually appropriate way. So the gender analysis helps us understand what the situation is and who we might involve and how, and also what some of those risks might be of excluding or including and how. So it's a very important thing to do well and to do it early, not just down the track. It's intended to inform the entire project that you're going to put in place, whether it be a water treatment plant or river basin modelling. Gender analysis is relevant in all cases. Again, we have some questions here about, has it been done early or is it sort of done somewhere down the track, in which case you're not really able to use the results to inform the project. And also, how have the monitoring evaluation strategies been linked to that analysis? So that will again give you clues as to what you need to watch that changes over time that's linked to the baseline. The meaningful participation. Obviously, we talk a lot about participation and how that can be done in the most meaningful way with the right people, and it's obviously hard to determine from the outside. But what we mean here is in recent years there's been a move to have quotas, so 50% of women on water user associations or on boards, etc. And that is definitely a key and a first step, but then also we need to look at, well, are those women supported to participate? Do they have the information resources to enable them to engage? And are they given the space and the support in terms of confidence, etc., to speak up and be genuinely involved? And so in this one, we're saying adopt a nothing about them without them approach. So no decisions should be made about a particular group or sector of society without them being involved and being able to influence the path. Okay, and so I guess this also is very nuanced, because who is marginalised in any context is very, it's very nuanced, it's very contextual, it's very specific to that particular domain, sector, project, and gender is just one layer of marginalisation. As I mentioned, there are lots of other elements: caste, age, disability, religion, etc. So it is very important to take a holistic, inclusive approach and not just go in thinking, okay, I just need to get women around the table and then we'll know, what an inclusive approach looks like. It is actually a bit bigger than that. But going back to the reason why we do this, the project will be more sustainable, will actually be of greater community benefit. And then there are numerous papers that talk about the economic value of a more inclusive approach and supporting marginalised people in these processes. So the evidence is there. It's just that it does take a little bit of thinking, drawing in the right people into your process, and genuine commitment. And then finally, this is about that point on resources such as land, very contentious issue, of course, and not one for someone like me in Australia to be coming and solving anyone's land issues, but the people within each context in the countries that have issues around women not being able to own land, or hereditary issues of land being transferred into somebody else's family's name, etc. There are NGOs, there are organisations on the ground and government agencies working on those issues. So how can water resource management make sure that it doesn't reinforce inequalities, such as water land ownership issues, but is actively working with those agents that are trying to make ownership of land water resources more equitable? So that's about partnerships again, and being conscious that we need to have more of a level playing field when it comes to access to and control of resources. Women, remember, do make up around 43% of the agricultural workforce, so have a huge stake in the management and ownership of land and water resources. And the checklist here talks about just having an understanding of the gender division of labour when it comes to things like irrigated farming, also the potential, the benefits of connecting to women's cooperatives or say irrigation associations that are open to being more inclusive and supporting and drawing on those organisations on the ground that are connected to that farming community, but are also open to making it more inclusive and drawing in those voices of women who are working very hard alongside men in the agricultural sectors. So the question is, where and when should we consider gender and inclusion? Well, naturally in the pre-design phase, so that's where the analysis phase comes in, as I mentioned, and then in the actual design of the project, making sure that there's participation and targeted approaches with people that are going to be affected by the project or beneficiaries. So that's the participation kind of side of things, and ensuring the participation informs the design. And then the implementation of the approaches, and that should be done in partnership with those organisations that are experts in inclusion and gender equality. And then through to the monitoring, evaluation and learning aspects of a project, making sure that we have a more sophisticated MEL framework than just how many women, how many men, how many people with disabilities, how many young people, etc. So there's obviously qualitative approaches that can be used and used in a very effective way to inform real-time learning and improvement of projects, to tap into the risk assessment process to ensure that you're not doing any harm as well. And then feeding these into the application. So this is obviously coming back through in an adaptive management sort of a process, feeding the monitoring outcomes into the program adaptation process. So on the monitoring evaluation side of things, there's two tools I wanted to draw your attention to. Firstly, this is a United Nations guideline for how to collect sex disaggregated water data. So I mentioned, how many men, how many women, but this particular working paper and the detail within it goes much further beyond that and gives lots of very practical ideas for your monitoring evaluation frameworks that will enable you to track things in a more meaningful way. So really highly recommend this particular resource. We can send all these links to you afterwards as well. And this one's for irrigation in particular, by Wimi and Cigar, and it again is a very, very practical, useful guide for considering the types of indicators that you might need for monitoring gender in an irrigation project. And I'll give you an example. Here's a sheet inside the guide that has the statement, both men and women were included in discussions of options for site location, design, and proposed technologies. This is a prompt. Has this happened in your project? Then there's some discussion questions. Did the scheme planners or implementers meet with women's groups to discuss the site location, design, and proposed technologies? Were a fair number of women's groups contacted compared to the total number that existed? So say there's 10 that exist and you only contacted one. So is that enough? Because we know that there's a range of organisations out there. It doesn't mean that they're fully representative of the whole population. So those sorts of prompting questions. And then there's a bit of a rating system. So for 1 point, only leaders were involved in the discussions or nearly all were men. For 2 points, most men in the community were involved and some women were as well. For 3 points, most men and women, including poorer and less poor women in the community, were actively involved in discussions. So it's just it's very crude, I know, but the tool itself is at least that next step forward in terms of it's not just men and women, how many, but what process has been undertaken and to what level were people engaged. So you can use this tool to sort of prompt thinking, but also to do a bit of a monitoring evaluation process of programs. So just in summary, the four kind of high-level findings and key messages that we have in this Global Water Partnership Guide are, first of all, institutional leadership and commitment are necessary and very powerful. We need to make gender equality and inclusion a core business goal, not just tacked on. Second area, gender and inclusion analysis that drives change. So not just analysis that sits on the shelf, but actually informs the program design, and that it needs to be done at all levels, as in different parts of a project, not just one element of it. We need to make sure that the full range of impacts, potential impacts, have been canvassed, and also who might be relevant to include in a particular project. Thirdly, meaningful and inclusive participation in decision-making and partnerships is necessary, and the sector is now at a point where it acknowledges that, but it's now, well, how? So a lot of people are interested in hearing good news stories of the how, and making sure we adopt a nothing about them without them approach. Fourthly, equal access to and control of resources is a very important area when it comes to the combination of water land entitlements and ownership, and so has to be addressed if we're going to have a more equitable water management regime. I just popped this here to mention that these issues are very relevant in Australia as well, and we have, for example, WASA has put together a bit of a one-pager about how water utilities in Australia can go further in championing gender equality, and that WASA is supporting initiatives of a range of utilities and governments, and that we are also beholden to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is not just an international development thing, that it's for everybody. So certainly very relevant here in Australia as well. And so here are some links for more information. We've got the Global Water Partnership website where you can find the action piece. ISF UTS, where I work, has a whole page on WASH and gender. And then feel free to contact me at these addresses, either on Twitter or via email. Very happy to connect with you and answer any more questions. And before I finish up, I did notice there was a question right at the beginning about equity versus equality. Yeah. And I just wanted to say that equality, we use the term equality because it is enshrined in human rights legal documents and discourses. It also features, it's a specifically used term in the Human Rights and Water and Sanitation Handbook that Katarina Albuquerque put together a couple of years ago when she was the Special Rapporteur for the Human Right to Water Sanitation. And she draws attention to the fact that it is a legally binding term, whereas equity is not. Okay, so thank you very much.
That's absolutely fantastic. It's such a measured overview, but with including take-home practical messages. That's been a really good overview. Thanks very much, Melita. Andrew Ross, Professor Andrew Ross from ANU, has got an interesting question here. You might be able to see it there. Gender inequality is accepted as a principle. In my experience, maybe gender equality is accepted as a principle, maybe. In my experience, in international projects, it's difficult to get gender disaggregated data about water access and use in terms of either quality or quantity. In the project you've been involved in, have you got data? If so, what are the sources? Easy question for you first up.
Great. I know, I love it. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. That's a great question. Look, the first thing that comes to mind is things like WaterAid in Timor-Leste have just started in the last few years a program called Rapid Wash. And so it's a tablet-based system where they're going house to house and collecting all the essential water access data, water and sanitation. So are they connected to the pipe system or rainwater tanks, that sort of thing, but also gender-related data. You're right that so the Joint Monitoring Program, as you would very well know, JMP, has all the data basically that is available at that higher level, sort of national level, on their website, available to download in Excel form. And there's obviously lots of questions about the accuracy of some of that data, but you can get all the higher level disaggregated data there. But yeah, there really is an issue in terms of, often that's at a household level, and so there's not a lot of intra or inter-household data. And I can definitely put together a few studies that do look at that a little bit, but at the end of the day, with the sector WASH level anyway, has focused a lot on at the household level rather than the gender dynamic level. So sometimes when organisations look at whether or not it's a female-headed household, then you'll sometimes get that data. But yeah, not a lot out there, I'd say.
No, that's a great answer, and thank you very much. Thanks again, Andrew, for that question. Jamie Hewitt says, I'd love to hear more about applying GESI, gender equity.
Social inclusion, Jesse.
Social inclusion in different countries, and how does it differ? Now, Enamal Siddiq, you'll see in the comment below that, he says there's a baseline when almost 100% of women say they have no knowledge of river governance, less than 5% are interested to participate. Do we still go for the bottom-up gender strategy? And if so, any suggestions on how to go about it?
Okay. So the question is kind of around potentially women's interest in the issues and also their confidence potentially, and so and direct involvement. So you're right that there could be some. I mean, it's a very deep and societally entrenched issue we're talking about here, in the water resource management sector can't fix it all by itself. But I guess the idea is that we do no harm, so we try not to perpetuate inequalities, and that we do what we can to address inequalities by using these opportunities to participate and share knowledge, etc., as much as is feasible and possible. So again, I would say that hopefully women's organisations or gender-focused organisations within a particular context may be able to provide some advice of how women can be best engaged and involved. And there can be so many barriers, obviously. So the confidence, the actual formal education, the technical know-how, but the knowledge and wisdom is often related to climate change issues, etc. It's just about how you tap into it in the most appropriate way. And I'd say those partnerships will help to find the more effective avenues. Yeah,
no, that's good. Susan Germain asked an interesting question. Where globally might we find great examples and case studies of best practice? You might be able to do that offline or in a few
Yes. Now, I'm always looking for them as well. There's a couple of case studies in the GWP piece from Africa, from Nepal. Definitely ISIMOD in Nepal seem to be doing some really great work in this space. In WRM though, I mean, I did a very big literature review and I found it very hard to find great examples of where things really are being applied on the ground.
Stephen Ponser asked, would you elaborate further on how the full inclusion of women can contribute to sustainable management, water management?
Yes, so that particular source, which again, hopefully you can look up or I can send a link, talks about the extent of failure in projects that are not planned with full inclusion of those that are affected. So in the WASH sector, a number that's thrown around is 40% failure rate of WASH infrastructure. So there's a whole lot of pipes and pumps, as we know, in the ground, not operating effectively. And one of the reasons why that is the case is because the people that are actually using that infrastructure were not part of the decision-making process from the outset. So that also goes to irrigation systems, potentially. You're not going to address food security issues if women are doing small-scale farming, but you don't actually talk to them about where and how an irrigation system should be managed. So it's about sustainability and effectiveness and the outcome level of your water management project, ensuring that it is informed by those people that are living in that environment and are knowledgeable about it.
Now that probably goes to thank you. That probably goes to Liliana's comment or question, saying that the reason she signed up for this webinar was she was recently introduced to the topic of WASH, and I'm curious to know more about gender issues in WASH management and sustainability.
Great.
So be
Well,
there for a fair while.
that's a big one. That's a big one because within WASH, as you know, it's sort of, there's lot of subcategories. So obviously you've got sanitation, so where you place a toilet, how it's maintained, what kind of technology you use, through to where you place a standpipe or a pump for a water system, women carrying water, schools and menstrual hygiene management. All of these issues have gendered elements to them of how technology is used, who decides where it's placed, what it means for women's time and effort and children, but also the dynamics between men and women. And sorry to be so binary in this talk and just talk about men and women. It's not as simple as that, and certainly don't advocate for a binary view of just men and women. But that's kind of the way we talk, unfortunately, for now. But yeah, so I guess if you wanted to email me any specific questions, WASH is definitely an area I'm very familiar with. I can point you to any direction on any WASH-related issue. But gender and violence has also been looked at a lot in the WASH sector. So the reduction of gender-based violence has been found to be the case when effective WASH programs have been put in place.
No, that's great. Would you prefer that the questions come via Australian Water School, ISWAM, or should we give them later on?
Raw. Whatever you prefer is fine. Yeah, as long as they get an answer, so that's great. Yep.
Okay, no, that sounds great. No, that's really good. Islam Al-Haq has asked, is gender equity more needed in developing countries than in developed? I don't know.
That's a great question. That's a great question because often people like me that are, consultants from Australia going off being gender specialists can be seen to be quite, I guess, neo-colonial, to put it bluntly.
Yep.
But we in Australia are struggling with huge issues related to gender equality around domestic violence, gender-based violence, a gap in pay between men and women, women not being represented in the higher echelons of management and society, parliament, etc. So without question, gender equality issues are certainly alive and well in Australia as well as the rest of the world.
No, that's a great answer. Yeah. Thanks. Sayed Hashimi has asked, could you please elaborate if in some countries women are not much involved in farmland activities, how could we include them in IWRM?
Great. Yeah, look, I think, again, it comes down to the fact that we are all using water one way or another. So if they're part of a catchment, then they're using water. And so they are beneficiaries, they are users one way or another. So there's some really amazing community-based, engagement planning processes that have been trialled around the world. And I think I'd just say that, yes, I've focused a lot on women as users of water in agricultural settings today, but certainly when it comes to river basin planning or catchment management, it's all users of water that are affected. Yeah.
Good. We're getting near the end here. We've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left, but Tahira has asked, most of the developing countries are talking and thinking about women and clean water rights, but North Americans are not to that point. I'm not sure what that first bit means, but then it goes on to say, in your opinion, how do you think that can be a global issue and bring a water balance for all?
Great. Yeah, well, hopefully the SDG 6 and its neighbour, SDG 5, gender equality, are ways to bring the whole world, together in terms of thinking about a similar framework. Yeah. Because the SDGs do apply to North and South countries, it's one way to kind of level that playing field in terms of us all coming together around a common agenda.
That's great. We had a SDG, Sustainable Development Goals webinar a week or two back, and there was hundreds of people at it. So we are running a short course on Sustainable Development Goals in 2 weeks' time. And so this is a little plug for everybody. If you go on the website and you want to join that short course, you'd be most welcome. I'll mention it again later, but it's really important. Well, look, I reckon we might leave it at that. I reckon we've hit pretty close to the hour, but we're so appreciative of your time, Melita, and thanks very much for taking the time over this and putting this up on the agenda. I think we should do it again next year. It'd be fantastic, and maybe a couple of them next
keep
year.
the conversation going.
Oh, totally agree.
Definitely.
I couldn't get over the vast resources spent on getting water in sub-Saharan Africa. Just a massive amount of people's time taken getting water. But then we
big waste.
should understand these things. We should understand them. Yeah. All right then. Well, look, just thanks everybody for participating, and stay on the line just for a tick. Feedback will come to you as we close down in a moment. We'll email that link to you. There's the free webinars coming up, and the online course I just mentioned, the 23rd, 30th of November, Sustainable Development Goals. That's something you can do from your very own computer. Don't need to travel. And face-to-face courses down there below there. Subscribe to YouTube and Twitter. You can see there. I want to make a point though of thanking my colleague Joel Waltman and colleagues Joel Waltman and Michelle Ha, who have helped us put this together. But thank you all for coming today. Most of all, Melita, for putting this all together for us so we could get a big picture.
Wonderful.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
See you again. Bye for now. Bye. Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au.